Sarah Martinez had always been different from other women her age. At 28, she possessed a calm confidence that came from years of rigorous training and life-threatening missions that most people could never imagine. Her petite frame of 5 feet 4 inches often led strangers to underestimate her, which had proven to be their mistake more times than she could count. The evening started like any other Friday night in downtown San Diego. Sarah had finished a grueling week of training exercises with her SEAL team and decided to meet her civilian friend Jessica for dinner at a popular waterfront restaurant. She had changed out of her military fatigues into a simple black dress and comfortable flats, wanting nothing more than to blend in with the regular crowd and enjoy a peaceful meal. Jessica arrived first, already seated at a table near the window overlooking the harbor. She waved enthusiastically as Sarah approached, her blonde hair catching the restaurant's warm lighting. Jessica worked as a nurse at the local hospital and had been Sarah's closest friend since college, long before Sarah had even considered joining the military. "I can't believe you actually made it." Jessica laughed as Sarah sat down. "I half expected you to cancel again because of some top-secret mission or training exercise." Sarah smiled, grateful for the normalcy of civilian conversation. "No missions this weekend. Just trying to remember how to be a regular person again." They ordered their meals and settled into comfortable conversation about everything except Sarah's work. Jessica shared gossip from the hospital, complained about her latest dating disasters, and filled Sarah in on mutual friends from college. For Sarah, these moments were precious. They reminded her of the life she was protecting, the normalcy that her sacrifices helped preserve. The restaurant buzzed with typical weekend energy. Couples shared romantic dinners, families celebrated birthdays, and groups of friends laughed over shared appetizers. Sarah found herself relaxing for the first time all week, her shoulders dropping as the tension from constant vigilance slowly melted away. At a large table across the dining room, a group of 6 men in their early 30s were already several drinks into their evening. They wore expensive suits and displayed the kind of aggressive confidence that came with successful careers in finance or real estate. Their voices grew progressively louder as the alcohol flowed, drawing annoyed glances from other diners. The leader of the group was Marcus Thompson, a 32-year-old investment banker who had built his reputation on aggressive tactics both in business and his personal life. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and used to getting his way through intimidation and his family's considerable wealth. His friends followed his lead without question, treating him like the alpha of their pack. Marcus had noticed Sarah the moment she walked in. Something about her composed demeanor and the way she carried herself intrigued him, though he couldn't quite put his finger on why. She wasn't the typical type that usually caught his attention. No flashy jewelry, no obvious attempts to attract male attention, no Instagram-perfect poses. Yet there was something magnetic about her quiet confidence. "Check out the brunette by the window," Marcus said to his friends, nodding in Sarah's direction. "She's got that mysterious thing going on." His friend Brad, a real estate developer known for his crude sense of humor, followed Marcus's gaze. "She's all right, I guess. Looks a little too serious for my taste. Probably one of those career women who thinks she's better than everyone else." Marcus took another sip of his whiskey and continued watching Sarah. He was used to women noticing him, used to the power his presence commanded in any room. The fact that Sarah hadn't even glanced in his direction despite his group's increasingly loud behavior only made her more interesting to him. As the evening progressed, Marcus became more fixated on Sarah. He watched how she laughed at her friends' stories, how she politely declined the waiter's suggestion for dessert, how she seemed completely unaware of the attention she was attracting from other men in the restaurant. This woman was different, and Marcus Thompson always got what he wanted. "I'm going to go introduce myself," Marcus announced to his friends, straightening his tie and running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. "Marcus, come on, let the woman eat in peace," suggested Tom, the most level-headed member of their group. "She's obviously having a nice dinner with her friend." But Marcus was already standing, his decision made. He had built his career on taking calculated risks and reading people, and something about Sarah told him she would be worth the effort. What he couldn't see was the way Sarah's posture had subtly shifted when she noticed his approach, her training automatically assessing potential threats even in civilian settings. Sarah's peripheral vision caught the movement before Jessica noticed anything. Years of combat training had given her an almost supernatural awareness of her surroundings, and she could sense Marcus approaching their table long before he reached them. Her muscles tensed slightly, not out of fear, but out of habit. In her world, unexpected approaches required immediate assessment. "Excuse me, ladies," Marcus said with his most charming smile as he reached their table. "I hope I'm not interrupting, but I couldn't help but notice you from across the room. I'm Marcus Thompson, and I was wondering if you'd like to join my friends and me for drinks after dinner." Jessica looked up with polite interest, but Sarah's response was measured and cool. "Thank you, but we're having a private dinner. We're not interested." Marcus's smile faltered for just a moment. He wasn't used to such direct rejection, especially delivered with such calm certainty. Most women either melted under his attention or at least seemed flattered by his interest. Sarah's response felt like a door being firmly closed in his face. "Are you sure? We're having a great time over there, and I think you'd enjoy yourselves. I own several restaurants in the area, and I could show you some places most tourists never see." "I'm sure they're lovely," Sarah replied, her voice remaining even and polite but firm. "But, as I said, we're having a private dinner. Thank you for the invitation." The rejection stung more than Marcus expected. He glanced around, aware that other diners were watching the interaction, including his friends who were surely judging his failure to charm these women. His ego, already inflated by alcohol and years of rarely being told no, began to bristle. "Look, I'm trying to be nice here," Marcus said, his tone shifting slightly. "I'm offering to buy you drinks and show you a good time. Most women would appreciate the gesture." Sarah set down her water glass and looked directly at Marcus for the first time. Her dark eyes were steady and unblinking, carrying a weight that made him unconsciously take a half step back. "I'm not most women, and I've already given you my answer. Please return to your table." The interaction was drawing more attention now. Other diners had stopped their conversations to watch, sensing the tension building at Sarah's table. Jessica shifted uncomfortably and used to confrontational situations and unsure how to help her friend. Marcus felt his face flush with embarrassment and anger. This woman was making him look like a fool in front of everyone, including his friends who were now watching with obvious amusement. He had always prided himself on his ability to charm anyone, and this rejection felt personal. "You know what? You're not even that pretty," Marcus said, his voice loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "I was trying to do you a favor. Women like you should be grateful when successful men like me show interest." The restaurant's atmosphere shifted perceptibly. Conversations died as people turned to stare at the escalating confrontation. The waiter who had been approaching their table hesitated, unsure whether to intervene or give the situation space to resolve itself. Sarah remained perfectly still, her expression unchanged. She had faced down armed terrorists and hostile forces in some of the world's most dangerous locations. An intoxicated businessman in a San Diego restaurant posed no real threat to her, but his behavior was crossing lines that demanded a response. "I think you should leave now," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying an authority that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her. "You've made your point, and you're disturbing other people's dinners." Marcus felt something he rarely experienced, a moment of genuine intimidation. There was something in Sarah's voice, in the way she held herself, that suggested he was treading on dangerous ground. But the alcohol and his wounded pride overrode his better judgment. "Don't tell me what to do," he snapped. "You think you're better than me? You think you can just dismiss me like I'm nobody?" The situation was spiraling beyond a simple rejected advance. Sarah could see that Marcus was the type of man who had never learned to handle rejection gracefully, and his alcohol-impaired judgment was making him increasingly aggressive. She had encountered men like him before, both in civilian life and in military settings. Men who confused confidence with aggression and believed their wants should override everyone else's boundaries. What Marcus didn't realize was that his behavior was triggering responses in Sarah that went far beyond normal social discomfort. Her training had taught her to recognize escalating threats and respond appropriately. While she had no intention of engaging in physical confrontation over a simple social disagreement, She was preparing for the possibility that this man might not accept reasonable boundaries. The moment that would change everything was approaching, though neither Sarah nor Marcus could have predicted exactly how the evening would unfold. Sarah's military training had prepared her for combat, but it had also taught her the importance of proportional response and protecting innocent bystanders. Marcus's privileged background had never taught him that some people couldn't be intimidated or bought, and his next decision would teach him that lesson in a way he would never forget. The tension in the restaurant had reached a level where even the kitchen staff had stopped their work to peer through the service window. Marcus stood beside Sarah's table, his face red with alcohol and wounded pride, while Sarah maintained her calm demeanor despite the increasingly hostile situation. Jessica reached across the table and gently touched Sarah's hand. "Maybe we should just go," she whispered, hoping to defuse the situation before it escalated further. She had known Sarah long enough to recognize the dangerous stillness that came over her friend when she was preparing for conflict. But Marcus heard Jessica's suggestion and interpreted it as weakness. "Yeah, maybe you should go," he said with a sneer. "Run away like the scared little girls you are. Probably can't even afford to eat here anyway." Sarah's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. She had spent years learning to control her emotions under extreme stress, but Marcus was pushing buttons that went beyond simple rudeness. His behavior reminded her of the worst kind of men she had encountered in her military service, those who used their power to intimidate and demean others simply because they believed they could. "Sir, I'm going to ask you one more time to return to your table," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a tone that made several nearby diners unconsciously lean away from their table. "Your behavior is inappropriate, and you're disturbing everyone here." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "What are you going to do about it? Call the manager? Call your daddy." He leaned closer to the table, invading Sarah's personal space in a way that was clearly meant to intimidate. "Let me tell you something, sweetheart. I know the owner of this place. I probably spend more money here in a month than you make in a year." The manager, a nervous man in his 40s named David Chun, had been watching the situation from across the restaurant. He approached their table with obvious reluctance, clearly hoping to resolve the conflict without losing a valuable customer. Marcus's claim about spending money at the restaurant wasn't entirely false. He was a regular patron who often brought business clients for expensive dinners. "Is everything all right over here?" David asked, dividing his attention between Marcus and Sarah. "Perhaps I could offer you folks a complimentary dessert or after-dinner drinks." Marcus straightened up, pleased to have the manager's attention. "Actually, David, these ladies were just leaving. They seem to think they're too good for this establishment." Sarah looked up at the manager with steady eyes. "We were having a pleasant dinner until this gentleman refused to accept our polite decline of his invitation. We would simply like to finish our meal in peace." David found himself caught between two customers, but Marcus's regular patronage and obvious wealth made his decision easier than it should have been. "Perhaps if everyone could just lower their voices, we could resolve this amicably," he said, though his tone suggested he was leaning toward Marcus's version of events. The manager's implicit support emboldened Marcus further. He had always found that his money and connections could smooth over any social friction, and this situation appeared to be following the same pattern. He decided to press his advantage. "You know what your problem is?" Marcus said to Sarah, pointing a finger uncomfortably close to her face. "You think being stuck up and rude makes you interesting. But all it makes you is a lonely woman who'll end up eating dinner alone for the rest of her life." Something shifted in Sarah's expression. Throughout her military career, she had endured far worse insults from enemies and even from fellow soldiers during training. But there was something about Marcus's entitled assumption that he could verbally abuse her without consequence that triggered a response she usually kept carefully controlled. "Remove your finger from my personal space," Sarah said quietly, "and step away from our table." Marcus noticed the change in her tone, but misinterpreted it as fear. The woman was finally backing down, he thought. About time she learned her place. Instead of backing away, he leaned even closer. "What if I don't? What's a little thing like you going to do about it?" The restaurant had gone completely silent now. Other diners sat frozen, some pulling out their phones to record what was clearly becoming a serious confrontation. The waitstaff had gathered near the kitchen door, unsure whether to intervene or call security. Sarah's training kicked in automatically. Marcus was now clearly in her personal space in an aggressive manner, pointing his finger inches from her face, and using language that constituted verbal harassment. In military terms, he had escalated from annoying civilian to potential threat. More importantly, his behavior was affecting innocent bystanders and disrupting a public space. "Sir, you have 3 seconds to step back," Sarah said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in life-or-death situations. Marcus laughed again, the sound harsh and mocking. 3 seconds? What kind of ridiculous? He never finished the sentence. Without any conscious decision, decades of training and wounded pride converged in a moment of poor judgment. Marcus's hand moved towards Sarah's shoulder, whether to push her, grab her, or simply emphasize his point. Even he wasn't entirely sure. But Sarah was sure. The moment his hand moved toward her in an aggressive manner, her training identified him as an immediate threat requiring neutralization. Her response was swift, precise, and completely disproportionate to the actual danger he posed. The slap came so fast that most witnesses weren't entirely sure what they had seen. One moment Marcus was leaning over Sarah's table with his hand extended toward her, and the next moment he was staggering backward, his hand pressed to his face, his eyes wide with shock and pain. But it wasn't just any slap. Years of hand-to-hand combat training, conditioning exercises, and real combat experience had given Sarah's movements a power and precision that Marcus had never encountered. The strike had been delivered with perfect form, using her entire body to generate force, aimed at the optimal angle to maximize impact and disorientation. Marcus stumbled backward into an empty chair, nearly falling over as his equilibrium was thrown off by the unexpected blow. His face burned with pain, and he could taste blood where his teeth had caught the inside of his cheek. But beyond the physical pain was something even more shocking. The complete humiliation of being overpowered by someone he had assumed was helpless. The restaurant erupted in gasps and shocked murmurs. Several people had been recording the confrontation on their phones, and the footage would later go viral on social media. But in that moment, everyone was too stunned to react immediately. Marcus straightened up slowly, his hand still pressed to his reddening cheek. His eyes had changed from annoyed superiority to something much darker. The alcohol in his system, combined with the public humiliation and physical pain, was pushing him toward a level of rage he rarely allowed himself to feel. "You crazy psycho," he shouted, his voice cracking slightly. "You can't just hit people. I'm calling the police. I'm pressing charges. Do you have any idea who I am?" Sarah remained seated, her expression unchanged, though Jessica could see the tension in her friend's shoulders. Sarah was already regretting her response, not because Marcus hadn't deserved it, but because she had allowed her training to override her civilian judgment. She had used military-level force in a civilian situation, and there would likely be consequences. But Marcus wasn't finished. His friends had risen from their table and were moving toward the confrontation, unsure whether to support him or try to calm him down. The largest of the group, Brad, was clearly intoxicated and looking for a fight. "Marcus, let's just go," Tom said, trying to grab his friend's arm. "This isn't worth it." But Marcus shook him off. He was beyond rational thought now, consumed by a rage that came from years of never being denied anything he wanted, never being physically overpowered, never being made to look weak in public. "No, this insane woman assaulted me. In front of everyone." His voice was growing shriller as the reality of what had happened sank in. "She's going to pay for this." The manager was frantically calling someone on his phone, presumably the police or security. Other diners were gathering their belongings and leaving, not wanting to be involved if the situation escalated further. The romantic atmosphere of the restaurant had been completely shattered. Sarah finally stood up, and her movement seemed to calm the room slightly. She was still several inches shorter than Marcus, but something about her posture and bearing made her seem larger. When she spoke, her voice carried easily through the restaurant despite its quiet tone. "You put your hands on me first," she said simply. "I defended myself. If you want to call the police, that's your right. But I'd suggest you think carefully about how you want to explain this situation to them. Marcus looked around the restaurant, suddenly, aware that dozens of people had witnessed the entire interaction. His friends looked embarrassed rather than supportive, and other diners were regarding him with obvious disapproval. The phones that had been recording would have captured his aggressive behavior leading up to the slap. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. He had been humiliated by a woman half his size in front of a room full of people, and his ego demanded satisfaction. What he didn't know was that his next decision would reveal exactly who he had chosen to antagonize, and that the consequences would extend far beyond a single evening's embarrassment. The police would arrive within minutes, but by then, Marcus would have made the mistake that would change both of their lives forever. He would learn that some people couldn't be intimidated, some battles weren't worth fighting, and some opponents were far more dangerous than they appeared. Sarah Martinez was about to remind him that appearances could be very deceiving indeed. Marcus Thompson had made many successful business decisions in his life, but his next choice would prove to be one of the worst mistakes he had ever made. Standing in the middle of the restaurant with his cheeks still burning from Sarah's slap, his pride wounded, and his judgment clouded by alcohol, he decided that retreat was not an option. "You know what?" Marcus announced loudly, his voice carrying throughout the now silent restaurant. "I don't care who you think you are. I don't care what kind of martial arts classes you took at your local gym. You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Sarah remained standing beside her table, watching Marcus with the kind of calm attention she usually reserved for potential enemy combatants. Jessica had moved to stand beside her friend, though she looked terrified and completely out of her depth in this escalating situation. The other diners watched in fascination and horror as Marcus pulled out his phone and began making calls. His first was to his lawyer, despite the late hour. His second was to someone he referred to as Detective Rodriguez, though whether this was an official contact or a personal friend wasn't clear to the observers. "Rodriguez? It's Marcus Thompson. I need a favor. I'm at Sunset Harbor Restaurant, and some crazy woman just assaulted me. I need her arrested immediately." His voice was loud enough for Sarah to hear every word, which seemed to be his intention. What Marcus didn't notice was that Sarah had also pulled out her phone. Unlike his dramatic public conversation, she sent a single, brief text message. To any observer, it would have seemed like she was simply letting someone know she would be late. In reality, she was following protocol for any Navy SEAL who found themselves in potential legal trouble while off duty. Within minutes, police officers arrived at the restaurant. Detective Rodriguez turned out to be a legitimate contact, a seasoned investigator who owed Marcus's family several favors from past business dealings. However, he was also a professional who took his job seriously, regardless of personal relationships. "All right, what's the situation here?" Detective Rodriguez asked as he surveyed the scene. The restaurant looked like a crime scene, with most diners having fled, and the remaining witnesses clustered in nervous groups. Marcus immediately launched into his version of events, describing Sarah as an unstable woman who had violently attacked him without provocation. He embellished the story significantly, claiming she had threatened him and used some kind of professional fighting technique that could have seriously injured him. "Look at my face," Marcus demanded, turning his still red cheek toward the detective. "This woman is dangerous. She needs to be arrested for assault and battery." Detective Rodriguez dutifully took notes and examined Marcus's injury, which was indeed visible, but hardly severe. He then turned to Sarah, expecting to find a defensive, possibly hysterical woman who would either deny everything or break down under questioning. Instead, he found himself looking at someone who radiated a calm confidence that was distinctly familiar. Rodriguez had been a military police officer before joining civilian law enforcement, and he recognized the bearing of someone with serious military training. "Ma'am, I'd like to hear your version of these events," he said professionally, though his tone had shifted slightly from when he'd been speaking with Marcus. Sarah's response was measured and precise. "This gentleman approached our table uninvited and became increasingly aggressive when we declined his invitation to join him for drinks. When his behavior escalated to physical intimidation and he moved to put his hands on me, I defended myself with minimal necessary force." "Minimal necessary force?" Marcus interrupted, his voice rising again. She almost broke my jaw. Detective Rodriguez held up a hand to silence Marcus, then turned back to Sarah. Something about her phraseology had caught his attention. Civilians didn't typically describe their actions in terms of minimal necessary force, unless they had specific training in conflict resolution and escalation management. Ma'am, do you have any military or law enforcement background? Rodriguez asked directly. The question sent a chill through Marcus, though he didn't immediately understand why. Sarah looked at the detective for a moment, clearly weighing her response. When she spoke, her words were careful and measured. I serve in the United States Navy, she said simply. The detective nodded slowly. Military personnel involved in civilian incidents required different handling procedures, and he would need to contact the appropriate military authorities regardless of how he chose to proceed with any charges. Marcus, however, completely missed the significance of this exchange. His ego was still wounded, and he saw Sarah's military service as just another detail in what he considered to be his victimization. I don't care if she's in the Navy, Marcus declared. She can't just go around attacking civilians. Military people aren't above the law. Detective Rodriguez was beginning to get a clearer picture of what had actually transpired in the restaurant. He had interviewed dozens of witnesses to bar fights and domestic disputes, and Marcus's story had several holes that were becoming more apparent as his agitation increased. Sir, I'm going to need you to lower your voice and let me conduct my investigation, Rodriguez said firmly. Can you tell me exactly what happened immediately before the alleged assault? As Marcus recounted his version of events, several witnesses began to contradict his story. The manager, despite his earlier deference to Marcus's status as a regular customer, was forced to admit under direct questioning that Marcus had been increasingly aggressive and had refused multiple requests to return to his table. Other diners provided statements describing Marcus's escalating behavior, his refusal to accept Sarah's polite rejection, and his decision to invade her personal space in what they described as a threatening manner. Several people had video footage on their phones that clearly showed Marcus leaning over Sarah's table and reaching toward her immediately before the slap occurred. But the real game-changer came when Detective Rodriguez received a phone call. He stepped away from the main group to answer it, and when he returned, his entire demeanor had changed. He looked at Sarah with new understanding and something approaching respect. Ma'am, I've just spoken with your commanding officer, he said quietly. There are some things we need to discuss privately. Marcus watched this exchange with growing confusion and anger. Why was the detective suddenly treating his attacker with kid gloves? Why did her commanding officer matter? She was just some low-level Navy person who had gotten lucky with a cheap shot. What Marcus didn't know was that Detective Rodriguez had just learned exactly who Sarah Martinez was. The brief phone call with her superior officer had revealed that Sarah wasn't just a Navy servicewoman. She was a Navy SEAL, one of the most elite special operations forces in the world. Moreover, she was currently assigned to a classified unit that conducted some of the most dangerous missions in modern military operations. The detective also learned that Sarah had recently returned from a deployment that had earned her and her team several commendations for actions that would likely never be made public. The woman standing calmly in front of him had skills and experience that made her potentially one of the most dangerous people in the entire city, yet she had shown remarkable restraint in dealing with Marcus's harassment. Detective Rodriguez found himself in a difficult position. Technically, Sarah had committed assault by striking Marcus, regardless of the provocation. However, any reasonable person could argue that she had acted in self-defense when Marcus had moved to physically intimidate her. More importantly, the video evidence clearly showed that Marcus had been the aggressor throughout the encounter. The detective also knew that prosecuting a decorated Navy SEAL for defending herself against an aggressive drunk businessman would be a public relations nightmare for the police department, especially when the victim was someone with Marcus Thompson's reputation for entitled behavior. Mr. Thompson, Detective Rodriguez said, returning to where Marcus was waiting impatiently. After reviewing the witness statements and available evidence, I'm not seeing sufficient grounds for assault charges. Marcus's face went white, then red with anger. What do you mean? She hit me. Look at my face. There are witnesses. Yes, sir, there are witnesses, the detective replied calmly. And those witnesses describe you as the aggressor in this situation. They describe you refusing multiple requests to leave these ladies alone, invading Ms. Martinez's personal space in a threatening manner, and reaching toward her immediately before she defended herself. Defended herself? Marcus's voice cracked with disbelief. I was just trying to talk to her. Sir, based on multiple witness accounts, your behavior could be construed as harassment, intimidation, and potentially attempted battery. Ms. Martinez appears to have used reasonable force to defend herself from what she reasonably perceived as a physical threat. Marcus looked around the restaurant in shock. His friends had gathered near the door, clearly wanting to leave and distance themselves from the situation. Other diners were regarding him with obvious disapproval. Even the manager, who had initially seemed sympathetic, was now avoiding eye contact. This is ridiculous, Marcus declared. My family has connections throughout this city. My lawyer will have your badge for this. Detective Rodriguez had heard similar threats many times throughout his career, usually from people who believed their wealth or connections placed them above accountability. His response was calm but firm. Sir, you're certainly free to contact your attorney and file any complaints you feel are appropriate. However, based on the evidence available, no charges will be filed against Ms. Martinez at this time. I would strongly recommend that you consider this matter closed. But Marcus Thompson wasn't the type of man who accepted defeat gracefully, especially when his pride had been wounded so publicly. His next words would prove that he had learned nothing from the evening's events, and that he was about to make his situation infinitely worse. This isn't over, he said, pointing directly at Sarah. You think being in the military makes you special? You think it gives you the right to attack people? I'm going to make sure everyone knows what kind of violent person you really are. The threat was clear, and it was directed at someone whose identity and service record were classified for national security reasons. Detective Rodriguez and Sarah both understood the implications immediately, though Marcus remained oblivious to the magnitude of his mistake. Sarah had spent years protecting her country from foreign enemies, but she had never expected to face threats from the very people she had sworn to defend. Marcus Thompson was about to learn that some battles weren't worth fighting, and some enemies were far more dangerous than they appeared. Marcus Thompson's threat to expose Sarah Martinez would prove to be the final miscalculation in an evening filled with poor decisions. What he didn't understand was that threatening a Navy SEAL with classified assignments crossed lines that extended far beyond local law enforcement and civilian courts. Within hours of Marcus's public declaration that he would make sure everyone knows what kind of violent person Sarah was, federal authorities became involved in the situation. Sarah's commanding officer had immediately reported the incident up the chain of command, not just as a matter of protocol, but because Marcus's threats potentially compromised operational security. The next morning, Marcus woke up in his expensive downtown condo with a massive hangover and a face that looked even worse in daylight. The right side of his jaw was swollen and discolored, making him look like he had been in a serious fight rather than slapped by a woman half his size. But his physical discomfort was nothing compared to what was about to unfold. His first indication that the situation had escalated beyond his expectations came when he tried to access his social media accounts. The video footage from the restaurant had indeed gone viral overnight, but not in the way he had hoped. Rather than generating sympathy for his assault by an aggressive woman, the videos clearly showed his increasingly threatening behavior and Sarah's measured response. The comment sections were brutal. Thousands of people had viewed the footage and overwhelmingly supported Sarah's actions. Marcus found himself being described as an entitled bully who had finally picked on the wrong person. Worse still, several news outlets had picked up the story, though they were being careful to protect Sarah's identity for security reasons. Marcus's second indication that he was in serious trouble came in the form of a phone call from his father, Harrison Thompson, a prominent businessman whose family had built their wealth through government contracts and political connections. Marcus, what the hell have you done? Harrison's voice was tight with anger and concern. I just received a very interesting call from someone at the Pentagon asking about my son's recent activities. The Pentagon? Marcus struggled to process this information through his hangover. Dad, what does the military have to do with anything? Some crazy Navy woman attacked me at a restaurant. Some crazy Navy woman? Harrison's voice rose dangerously. Marcus, Do you have any idea who you threatened last night? Do you understand what you've gotten yourself into? The truth was that Marcus didn't understand. In his privileged world, conflicts were resolved through lawyers, money, and family connections. He had never encountered anyone whose protection extended beyond civilian authorities into the realm of national security. Harrison Thompson, however, understood perfectly. His business dealings had brought him into contact with military procurement officers and defense contractors throughout his career. The phone call from the Pentagon had made it clear that his son had threatened someone whose identity and activities were classified at the highest levels. "Marcus, listen to me very carefully," Harrison said, his voice now deadly serious. "You are going to drop this matter immediately. You are going to delete any social media posts about this incident. You are going to tell your friends to do the same. And you are going to pray that the people you've antagonized are feeling merciful." But Marcus's pride still wouldn't allow him to accept defeat. "Dad, I can't just let this go. She humiliated me in front of everyone. People are laughing at me online. My reputation, your reputation will be the least of your concerns if you continue down this path," Harrison interrupted. "The woman you threatened isn't just some sailor, Marcus. She's part of an elite unit that handles classified operations. Threatening her isn't just assault. It's potentially a matter of national security." The words slowly penetrated Marcus's hangover fog. National security. Classified operations. Elite unit. For the first time since the incident, he began to understand that he might be facing consequences far beyond anything he had anticipated. His understanding became complete when two men in dark suits arrived at his office later that morning. They identified themselves as federal agents and requested a private conversation about his recent interactions with military personnel. The meeting was brief but educational. The agents explained in very clear terms that threatening active-duty special operations personnel, especially those involved in classified activities, was taken extremely seriously by federal authorities. They informed Marcus that his social media accounts were being monitored, that any further attempts to identify or threaten Sarah Martinez would result in immediate federal charges. More importantly, they made it clear that his family's political connections would not protect him if he continued to pursue this matter. In fact, his father's government contracts could be jeopardized if Marcus's actions were perceived as a threat to operational security. The agents left Marcus with a choice: drop the matter entirely and agree to leave Sarah Martinez alone, or face federal charges that could result in significant prison time and the destruction of his family's business empire. Meanwhile, Sarah Martinez was dealing with her own consequences from the evening's events. She sat in her commanding officer's office, facing a stern review of her actions from Commander Rebecca Stone, a veteran officer who had supervised many difficult situations involving SEAL team members and civilian conflicts. "Petty Officer Martinez," Commander Stone began, using Sarah's formal rank, "while I understand that you were defending yourself from what appears to have been legitimate harassment, your response was disproportionate to the actual threat level." Sarah maintained military bearing throughout the debriefing, accepting responsibility for her actions while explaining the circumstances that led to her decision to strike Marcus. She acknowledged that her training had taken over in a situation that could have been handled through de-escalation techniques. "Ma'am, I should have controlled my response better," Sarah admitted. "I allowed my training to override civilian protocols, and I put both myself and the mission at risk through my actions." Commander Stone studied the young SEAL sitting across from her desk. Sarah Martinez had an exemplary service record, with multiple commendations for actions in combat zones that had saved both military and civilian lives. The incident at the restaurant was completely out of character for someone who had shown remarkable judgment under far more stressful circumstances. "Petty Officer Martinez, based on the witness statements and video evidence, it appears that you showed considerable restraint given your capabilities," Commander Stone said finally. "A civilian making the same threat might have required hospitalization rather than walking away with a bruised ego." The commander went on to explain that Marcus's subsequent threats had elevated the incident beyond a simple civilian altercation. The fact that he had threatened to expose a SEAL team member's identity and activities meant that federal authorities were now involved in protecting both Sarah and operational security. However, Commander Stone continued, This incident highlights the need for better training in civilian interaction protocols. You'll be attending additional courses on de-escalation techniques and civilian relations. We can't have our people responding to drunk businessmen the same way they would respond to enemy combatants. Sarah accepted the additional training requirements without complaint. She understood that her actions, while legally defensible, had created complications that could have been avoided through better judgment. But the story wasn't over for Marcus Thompson. Despite the federal warning and his father's desperate attempts to contain the situation, Marcus's ego wouldn't allow him to accept that he had been outsmarted by someone he still thought of as just a Navy woman. 3 days after the restaurant incident, Marcus made his final mistake. Convinced that he could still salvage his reputation and get revenge on Sarah, he hired a private investigator to gather information about her background and activities. The private investigator, a former police officer named Doug Warren, took Marcus's money and began looking into Sarah Martinez's background. What he found made him immediately regret taking the case. Sarah Martinez wasn't just a Navy SEAL. She was a member of one of the most elite and secretive units in the entire military. Her mission record was almost entirely classified, but the portions that Warren could access revealed someone who had participated in operations that were the stuff of Hollywood movies. She had been deployed to some of the most dangerous locations in the world, had faced down genuine terrorists and enemy combatants, and had saved countless lives through her actions. More importantly, Warren discovered that federal authorities were already monitoring anyone who showed interest in Sarah's background. His inquiries had immediately triggered alerts that brought federal agents to his office within hours. Warren found himself facing the same choice that Marcus had been given: cease all investigations immediately or face federal charges for attempting to compromise national security. Being a former law enforcement officer, Warren understood the seriousness of the situation and immediately contacted Marcus to return his money and terminate the investigation. Marcus's reaction to this news was the final nail in his own coffin. Frustrated and humiliated by his inability to get satisfaction through normal channels, he made a series of phone calls to local news stations, claiming he had information about military personnel engaging in illegal activities. The calls were monitored and recorded. Federal agents arrived at Marcus's condo the following morning with arrest warrants. Marcus Thompson, who had never faced serious consequences for his actions in his entire privileged life, found himself charged with multiple federal offenses related to threatening military personnel and attempting to compromise operational security. His family's wealth and connections proved useless against federal prosecutors who took national security threats seriously. The case never went to trial. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of decades in federal prison, Marcus accepted a plea agreement that included significant jail time, substantial fines, and a permanent prohibition against contacting or investigating military personnel. His father's business empire survived, but barely. Several government contracts were terminated, and the family's political influence was permanently damaged. Harrison Thompson spent the rest of his career trying to rebuild what his son's actions had destroyed. Sarah Martinez returned to her duties with her SEAL team, though she carried the lessons from that evening with her for the rest of her career. She had learned that the skills that made her effective in combat situations required careful control in civilian settings, and that the people she had sworn to protect didn't always deserve that protection. But she had also learned something else, that sometimes standing up to bullies, even when the response was imperfect, could have consequences that extended far beyond the immediate situation. Marcus Thompson's attempt to intimidate her had not only failed but had ultimately led to justice for his pattern of entitled behavior. The restaurant where it all began installed a plaque near the table where Sarah and Jessica had been sitting that night. It read simply, "Reserved for heroes." The management never explained what it meant, but the staff and regular customers understood. It was a reminder that heroes come in many forms, and sometimes they're sitting quietly at the table next to you, asking for nothing more than to enjoy dinner in peace. Marcus Thompson learned the hardest way possible that some people can't be intimidated, some fights aren't worth starting, and some enemies are far more dangerous than they appear. Sarah Martinez had spent her career protecting America from foreign threats, but Sometimes the most important battles are fought in restaurants against entitled bullies who mistake civility for weakness. In the end, Marcus Thompson discovered that when you slap a Navy SEAL, metaphorically or literally, you better be prepared for the consequences. And those consequences can be far more severe than anything you imagine when you're drunk on alcohol and your own sense of superiority.